What is complementarianism? This will be my concluding statement in the debate I'm having with my daughter over egalitarianism versus complementarianism. Complementarianism defines roles between husbands and wives and between men and women in the church while asserting the equality of personhood between all males and females. So there is no male superiority, no female inferiority, but there are different ways in which godly exercise of different functions takes place between husbands and wives and between men and women and the church, and that can take place without a sense of superiority or inferiority. Husbands and fathers have authority and responsibility in the home that their wives do not have. But at the same time, wives have duties to their husbands and to their children that husbands do not have. There's a differentiation of functions or roles. That's the basic. A couple of other observations, related observations that could be made at this point. Complementarianism, at least in the version that I am defending, does not espouse the position that women can never occupy or exercise leadership functions. They are not to do so in an explicit way of teaching all men within a Christian assembly, but that does not mean that women don't have other leadership functions. In the biblical text, there are examples such as Deborah, the judge, prophetess, and spiritual leader in Israel. She is not a permanent example. In other words, there aren't other women prophetesses and judges that follow in the house of Israel, but she is an outstanding example of leadership that takes place. So it is something that contemporarily happened, and God can bless it. So my version of complementarianism is not denying leadership authority. However, in the home, wives have a godly sense of submission to their husbands, who are in ultimate, have the position of ultimate authority. They are to be setting a godly example and teaching in the home in a way in which their wives will follow that, both their example and their teaching content, and be passing that down to their children as well. Another thing that should be noted at this point is complementarianism is really undercutting that false teaching or lie that society imposes on women, that in order to be equal to your husbands, you must not only bear children and be taking care of the home, but you must also have a comparable job outside the home that's providing for the family as well as your husband. So women are not only told they have to do the childbearing and childrearing, but they also have to have a position similar to their husbands outside of the home. That is just a lie. That is a very misleading way in which to try to set up a superhero mother/wife that the Bible simply does not teach or advocate. So complementarianism is really denying that. It's really undercutting that lie.
Melanie makes, in her rebuttal, makes a very strong point and a strong argument about submission, that it's not directly related to my treatment of the creation and fall account given in Genesis. So she's pointing out that because Adam, in tending the garden and supplying the financial needs for his family, and his wife Eve in bearing the harder or difficult labor and having children and tending the home, now that does not necessarily have anything to do with submission. Well, I did say in my opening statement, I argued that this laid a foundation. I believe I used the phrase laid a foundation. There are some other I think there are some other reasons, though, that might factor into this, really setting the stage for submission and Adam's greater responsibility. So a husband has greater authority and responsibility, and the wife has in a sense, a greater role of accepting, submitting, or trusting God to work through his authority. But yes, that is present here in a sketchy format. Adam, in bearing the financial needs of the family, is expected to maintain and uphold not just the financial needs, but also his own marriage. He has to take greater responsibility for that. And I think there are other cues in the text for that. For example, Adam is first given the command by God to abstain from eating the fruit, the forbidden fruit. And he obviously passes on this instruction to Eve, but he doesn't do it quite accurately. Perhaps he just teaches it kind of in an offhand way. And Eve, when in her dialogue with the serpent who is tempting her, did add something that wasn't even in the original command that God gave to Adam. So Adam failed in this regard of teaching. And then also Adam is given the command to leave and cleave. It's considered the leave and cleave command, setting aside or leaving the father and mother and being joined to his wife. Now that's something given only to Adam and not to Eve. So she has a responsibility that's subordinate to his, but his overarching authority is to take responsibility for the maintenance of the family and his own marriage. So if a husband is married to a wife who is concerned about communication in the marriage, that is the husband's responsibility. He needs to take note and act accordingly to restore the marriage or the communication gap or barrier, whatever it's going on. Let's take a look at a diagram of this solution of egalitarianism versus the construction from complementarianism. We can see, we would note that there would have to be some way to equate the labor or the work that's being done by husband and wife. So the wife's labor in giving birth to children might equal some form of labor that the husband does in providing for his wife and his future child. How would that work, though? Would that be 50-50? Can we compare? Can we equate the work and the difficulty that's involved in childbirth to the sort of work that the husband would be engaged in supplying the financial needs of his family? How exactly does that work out? It doesn't seem very plausible. There are different types of work. There are different kinds of work. So how would we end up with a 50-50 division of responsibility and authority, or even 100%? That just doesn't seem to follow very well. So we cannot really equate an amount of a particular type of work with a different type of work. And that certainly would not lead to an equation or the same amount of responsibility or authority. Let's talk about taking care of the children for a moment. Melanie used a portion of a Grey's Anatomy episode to show how, in fact, some mothers can become so consumed with their careers or their jobs that they do neglect their children. Now, in the case that she was bringing up, I believe that was a single mother. That wasn't a two-parent family for that adopted child that was shown in that episode. But in this case, let's assume for a moment that it was a two-parent family. How would we get equal responsibility and authority there? So the wife would have just as much authority over the child, 50%, as the husband would have, 50%. That there would be different teachable moments where the father would spend time with the child, certainly, but would that be exactly 50%? In that case, then, if the mother spent 70% of the child's time with a parent with that child, and the father only took up 30% of the time, then that would present an immediate inequity. Would that change, then, the amount of authority and responsibility that the parent has over that child? That just does not seem to be a practical solution to the problem. In complementarianism, however, the father's responsibility is greater than his wife's, responsibility for taking care of the whole family, which includes the children. Now, this does not mean, it does not break down into a time equation. A wife may indeed spend much more time with the children than her husband does due to work-related or other issues, but the father would make sure that there were good relations between himself and the children and their mother and the children and each other than the wife would. Because that is something that God has given him to establish order and peace in his home. It's not the job of the wife to take care of that or have to worry about that. Children need an overarching authority figure, just as they need a figure who will take care of their wounds, bandage them up, a mother. They also need an overarching figure who will enforce rules when they try to test barriers or boundaries and maybe backtalk to their mother or sass their mother. They need an overarching father figure who is in charge of the family. According to her assessment of egalitarianism, it eliminates the inequality between authority and responsibility. Now, I find this a very peculiar assertion as well. How does egalitarianism as a view eliminate inequity between authority and responsibility? This is actually just a part of sinful nature. Somebody wants to have more authority, but they want that authority to command others without the attending responsibility. They don't want accountability when they go wrong, when they go astray, when they mislead or misguide others due to the authority that they assume. So, how egalitarianism would eliminate inequity between authority and responsibility is really a big question mark. And Melanie doesn't provide any argument for this in her rebuttal, but she does use the argument to try to make egalitarianism seem attractive. In light of Kostenberger's scholarship, Melanie's conclusion that Othentine would have a very negative connotation seems to be modified now, and I think that she would benefit from interacting a little bit more with that. If it's negative, then the teaching element would be negative, but that would be very uncharacteristic of Paul to view teaching that way, especially since the Greek word is available and he uses it in the epistle to Titus, where he's talking about the term for false teaching. So Melanie not only needs to show that the latter is negative then, but she would need to argue then that the former, teach, would be negative, and then she'd have to account for why Paul doesn't just use the normal verb there for false teaching. Because if he was just, and the other problem with that is then why, if it's the false teaching and the sort of usurping authority that's ungodly, kind of like lording it over, the expression that Christ uses in the Gospels, don't lord it over one another like the pagans or the Gentiles. Well, if that's the case, then why would Paul direct that just at women and not at men? So there's a couple of problems with that construal of Othentine.